I'm Dr. Marcus Webb. For those who don't know me, I spent 42 years cutting open the dead and listening to what they had to say. Started at Bellevue Hospital back in 1973, when forensic pathology was still finding its feet, still relying on instinct as much as science. I've stood over tables in New York, Los Angeles, and half a dozen cities in between. I've examined bodies pulled from rivers, found in locked rooms, discovered weeks after death in apartments where neighbors complained about the smell. I've worked cases that made headlines, cases that never should have happened, cases that still visit me when I close my eyes at night. Celebrity overdoses. Serial killers who left signatures in flesh. Epidemic victims before anyone understood what was killing them. In 2015, I hung up my scalpel, but the morgue never really leaves you. The dead don't stop talking just because you've retired. They whisper from memory, from dreams, from the edges of sleep where logic dissolves and old certainties crack like ice under pressure. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about something that happened in November 1998. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about death, about consciousness, about the moment when life becomes absence. I've never spoken about this publicly. I've barely spoken about it at all. But I'm 67 now, and some stories demand to be told before the person carrying them joins the subjects they've spent a lifetime studying. What happened that night defies explanation, contradicts medical science, and refuses to fade no matter how many years I put between myself and that cold autumn evening when a corpse reached for me in the dark. Before we begin, I need you to do something. Find a comfortable position. Close your eyes if you can, or let your gaze soften on something neutral, something that won't demand your attention. This isn't a story you listen to while multitasking, while scrolling, while half present. The dead deserve more respect than that, and frankly, so does your own nervous system. What I'm about to share will crawl under your skin if you let it. It will make you question assumptions you didn't know you held. I spent 4 decades in rooms with death, and I learned that the boundary between living and dead is far stranger than anyone admits. The body keeps secrets. Sometimes it keeps them past the point where secrets should be possible. So breathe, settle in, let the ordinary world receive for the next hour. You're about to enter the morgue with me, about to stand beside a steel table in the small hours of the morning, about to witness something that changed how I understand the final transition we all must make. You're about to learn why I never, ever work alone with the dead anymore, even though for most of my career, I preferred it that way. And why, sometimes, while I'm alone at night, I can still feel cold fingers wrapped around my wrist, pulling with impossible strength, drawing me closer to lips that should never have moved again. The Los Angeles County Coroner's office runs 24 hours, but the deep night shift from midnight to 8 carries a particular quality of isolation. By November 1998, I'd been there 6 years, transferred from New York where the winters had started bothering my joints and the relentless pace had begun wearing grooves in my mental health. Los Angeles offered more sunlight, slightly less chaos, though death never really takes a holiday regardless of geography. I developed a reputation for being reliable with the overnight work. Most pathologists hate it. Disrupts your circadian rhythm, leaves you bleary-eyed and irritable, plays havoc with any attempt at normal social life. But I was divorced by then, my daughter grown and living in Seattle, my social life consisting mainly of other doctors who understood why I smelled faintly of formaldehyde and disinfectant no matter how thoroughly I scrubbed. The night shift suited me. Fewer administrative interruptions, no observers or students asking questions, just me and the work and the fluorescent lights humming their endless electrical hymn. That particular Tuesday started quietly. I'd arrived at 11:30, reviewed the cases waiting for morning, checked the cold storage. 3 bodies scheduled for examination Wednesday, nothing urgent, nothing unusual. A traffic fatality, straightforward. An elderly woman found in her apartment, probable natural causes. A construction accident requiring documentation for workers' compensation. Routine. The kind of cases that form the foundation of forensic pathology, unglamorous but necessary, each person deserving the same careful attention regardless of how they died. Around 1 in the morning, I was in my office working on reports from the previous week when the phone rang. Outside line, not internal. I almost didn't answer. Protocol suggested. Coroner's office, Dr. Webb speaking. My voice carried the flatness of long experience, professional neutrality that suggests competence without promising comfort. Dr. Webb, this is Detective Maria Sanchez, LAPD Central Division. Sorry to call so late. We've got a situation at the Roslyn Hotel downtown, and we need a pathologist on scene before we move the body. I sat up straighter. On-scene calls were unusual. Most bodies came to us after police and paramedics had done their initial work. Requesting a pathologist at the location suggested something complicated, something that required expert assessment before evidence was disturbed. "What's the situation?" I asked, already reaching for my coat. Male victim, approximately 30 years old, found in room 412. Door was locked from inside, no signs of forced entry. Guest in the next room called the front desk complaining about noise around midnight. Manager used the master key, found the victim. Here's where it gets strange. She paused, and I could hear her choosing words carefully. The body presents with injuries inconsistent with any weapon or instrument we can identify. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene, but the physical presentation is unlike anything the responding officers have encountered. We need documentation before we transport, and frankly, Dr. Webb, we need someone to tell us what we're looking at. 20 minutes later, I was parking outside the Roslyn Hotel on 5th Street, a 1914 building that had seen better decades. The architecture spoke of Jazz Age optimism, but the neighborhood had declined, and the hotel now catered to long-term residents with limited options and tourists who value cheap rates over comfort or safety. 3 patrol cars sat outside, their lights washing the facade in alternating red and blue. A small crowd of residents had gathered on the sidewalk despite the cold and the hour, human nature's perpetual fascination with death on display. Detective Sanchez met me in the lobby. She was 40 or so, compact and precise in her movements, the kind of cop who had seen enough to rarely be surprised but still retained enough humanity to be troubled by the truly bizarre. We rode the elevator in silence, the car groaning upward through the building's aging infrastructure. The 4th floor hallway smelled of old carpet, cooking oil, and the particular mustiness of inadequate ventilation. Room 412 stood open, 2 uniformed officers flanking the door, their faces carefully neutral in the way young cops learn when they don't want to reveal that something has gotten under their skin. The room was standard cheap hotel, queen bed, nightstand, small desk, bathroom visible through an open door. The body lay on the floor between the bed and the window, and Sanchez was right. The presentation was unusual. The victim was male, Caucasian, 30 to 35 years old, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. But his position and the visible trauma made me pause at the threshold, my professional assessment momentarily interrupted by simple visceral reaction. His face was locked in an expression of absolute terror, mouth open in a frozen scream, eyes wide and staring at something only he could see. That wasn't unusual in itself. Agonal expressions occur, muscular contractions at the moment of death that can create disturbing facial configurations. But this went beyond normal post-mortem presentation. His hands were raised, fingers splayed, as if pushing against something invisible, and his chest showed what appeared to be deep impressions, 5 on each side of his ribcage, as if enormous hands had gripped him and squeezed until something vital ruptured. No blood, no tearing of the clothing or skin, just profound bruising that suggested catastrophic internal damage from compression. I spent 90 minutes at that scene, photographing, measuring, taking preliminary notes. The room offered no explanation. No weapons, no drugs visible, no signs of struggle beyond the body's final position. The door had been locked from inside, chain engaged, no indication anyone else had been present. Yet the injuries suggested force applied with inhuman strength, pressure that should have left corresponding marks on the surroundings but hadn't. I authorized transport to the morgue and told Sanchez I'd have preliminary findings by morning. Drove back through empty streets, mind already cataloging possibilities. Undiagnosed cardiac condition that caused him to collapse while having a seizure, falling in a way that created the bruising? Unlikely, given the bilateral symmetry. Some kind of industrial accident earlier in the day, delayed presentation of trauma? Possible, but the bruising appeared fresh, consistent with perimortem injury. Poison that caused muscular contraction strong enough to fracture ribs from the inside? I'd seen something similar once with strychnine, but that had different visual markers. By the time I got back to the morgue, the transport team had delivered the body. I logged it as John Doe pending identification, case number 98 to 7743, and wheeled him into examination room 3, my preferred space for complex cases. The room was 15 by 20 feet, walls tiled in white ceramic that could be hosed down, steel table in the center with drainage channels, instrument trays arranged with the precision I'd developed over decades. Overhead lights bright enough to eliminate shadows, ventilation system that exchanged the air every 4 minutes to manage the smells inherent to the work. I was alone. The overnight assistant had called in sick, and I hadn't bothered requesting a replacement for what should have been a quiet shift. Standard protocol suggested waiting for a second person, but I'd conducted hundreds of examinations solo over the years. The dead don't require supervision. They don't move, don't react, don't pose any threat beyond the biological hazards their fluids might contain. I should have waited until morning. Should have logged the body in cold storage and tackled the examination during regular hours with proper staffing. But curiosity and professional pride overrode caution. I wanted to understand what had killed this man, wanted to solve the puzzle before the next shift arrived, wanted the satisfaction of providing Sanchez with answers when she called for the preliminary report. Arrogance, maybe, or just the accumulated confidence of 4 decades working with the dead. I prepped the body using standard procedure, photographed the clothed presentation, documented the injuries visible through clothing, then carefully removed and bagged each item. The t-shirt revealed more of the same bruising across his torso, the pattern suggesting fingers and palms, the depth indicating tremendous force applied directly to the body. I was collecting fingernail scrapings when I noticed the temperature. Examination room 3 was always cold, kept at 55 degrees to slow decomposition and manage odor. But this felt colder, cold enough that I could see my breath, which shouldn't have been possible given the thermostat settings. I glanced at the wall unit. Still set at 55, but the temperature reading showed 48 and dropping. I made a mental note to call maintenance when they came on at 6. Faulty temperature control could compromise examinations, and while the cold helped preservation, you could go too far. I'd seen frozen tissue tear during organ removal, making microscopic analysis difficult. But that was a problem for later. I continued working, weighing and measuring, creating the systematic documentation that forms the foundation of forensic pathology. The external examination took 45 minutes. By the time I was ready to make the Y incision and begin internal work, the temperature had dropped to 44 degrees, and my fingers were starting to stiffen despite the latex gloves. The room's fluorescent lights flickered twice, dimmed, then returned to full brightness. Electrical problems on top of HVAC failure. The building was old, the infrastructure constantly struggling. I was positioning the scalpel for the initial cut when the lights went out completely. Not a flicker, not a dim. Complete darkness, the kind that's absolute and disorienting, that makes you question where your body is in space. I stood motionless for 3 seconds, waiting for the emergency backup to kick in. Every examination room had battery-powered lights that should activate automatically during power failures. 5 seconds. Nothing. 8 seconds. The darkness remained total. I lowered the scalpel to the instrument tray by touch, careful not to drop it, not to contaminate it against my coat or the floor. Started moving slowly toward where I remembered the door being, hands extended, feeling for the wall, the counter, anything solid to orient myself. That's when I heard it. A breath. Not the ventilation system, not the building settling, not any mechanical sound I could rationalize. A breath, drawn in slowly, held for a moment, then released in a long exhalation that carried a faint wet quality, like air passing through fluid-filled passages. It came from the direction of the examination table, from where the body lay. I froze. Told myself it was post-mortem gas release, the kind of sounds that had startled me my first year in pathology school before I learned that the dead body is essentially a biological machine winding down, pockets of gas escaping, tissues settling under gravity, fluids finding new equilibrium. Nothing supernatural, nothing that violated the physics of decomposition. Except the body was fresh, less than 3 hours post-mortem, gas production shouldn't be significant yet. And the sound came again, definitely a breath, inhalation and exhalation, rhythmic, purposeful. My heart was hammering now, professional detachment giving way to primate terror, the ancient fear of darkness and the uncanny that lives underneath all our civilized certainty. I forced myself to move, one hand extended, following the wall, looking for the light switch by the door. My fingers found the switch plate, flipped it up and down. Nothing. The power was definitely out, not just the overhead lights but everything, the entire room dead electrically. I was fumbling for my phone when I heard movement behind me. Not the small sounds of settling tissue. Movement. The rustle of the paper sheet covering the examination table. The whisper of skin against stainless steel. And then footsteps. Slow, dragging, the shuffle of bare feet on tile. Coming toward me. I spun, back against the wall, phone finally in my hand, thumbing it on. The screen glow seemed impossibly bright after the complete darkness, a small rectangle of blue-white light that turned the examination room into a space of harsh shadows and insufficient illumination. The body was sitting up. John Doe, case number 98 to 7743, the man who had been definitively dead for hours, was sitting upright on the examination table, legs hanging over the edge, head turned toward me. His eyes were open. That's what I remember most clearly. His eyes were open and focused, not the cloudy gaze of the recently deceased, not the fixed stare of post-mortem muscular contraction, but clear and aware and looking directly at me. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, to reassert human language and rational thought against what I was witnessing. Nothing came out. My throat had closed, my diaphragm locked, my body in the grip of fight or flight response so intense that higher cognitive function had temporarily shut down. He slid off the table, movement stiff but purposeful, feet touching the floor with soft slapping sounds. Started walking toward me, arms at his sides, that expression of terrible awareness on his face. I should have run. Should have thrown the door open and gotten out, gotten distance, gotten help. But I was paralyzed, back pressed against the wall, phone held up between us like a child's talisman against monsters. He kept coming, crossing the distance between the examination table and the wall where I stood frozen. 3 feet away. 2 feet. Close enough that I could smell him now, not the smell of decay but something else, something chemical and burnt, like ozone after a lightning strike. He raised his right hand, reached toward me, and I found my voice, found the ability to move, started to slide along the wall away from him, started to say something. You're not real, this isn't happening, you're dead. the desperate words of someone confronting the impossible. But he was faster than his shuffling walk suggested. His hand shot out, fingers wrapping around my left wrist with a grip that was cold, terribly cold, cold enough that I could feel it through the latex glove, through my skin, cold that went into the bone and made my entire arm go numb. He pulled, not gently, with shocking strength, yanking me forward so that I stumbled, fell against him, my face inches from his. His mouth opened, and he spoke. Not the agonal sounds the newly dead sometimes make, gas forcing past vocal cords, creating groans or sighs that mimic speech. This was speech, formed words, deliberate communication. "Listen," he said, his voice a dry whisper that carried nonetheless in the silence of the examination room. "You have to listen." Then he pulled me closer, his left hand coming up to grip my shoulder, holding me in place, his face so close to mine that I could see every detail in the phone light that was now pressed between our bodies. See the burst capillaries in his eyes, see the cyanosis at the edges of his lips, see every marker of recent death on a face that was nevertheless moving, speaking, expressing intention. His breath, when it washed across my face, was cold and smelled of nothing. Not decay, not the last meal, not anything. Just cold. "They're not done," he whispered, the words coming faster now, urgent, desperate. "The door isn't closed. You think death is the end, but there's a space between, and they wait there, they wait and watch, and sometimes they reach through." That's what happened to me. I let them in and they didn't let go. I was trying to pull away, trying to break his grip, but his fingers were like iron bars, strength that shouldn't be possible in a dead body, that violated everything I knew about post-mortem relaxation and muscular capability. He was pulling me closer, his mouth near my ear now, and he was still whispering, words coming in a rushed stream. "You've seen them before, all those bodies you've cut open. Some of them didn't go peacefully, some of them had time to see what was waiting. You thought it was agonal expression, trauma response, but some of them knew, some of them saw through the door, and what they saw made them fight, made them try to stay even though the body was failing. That's the mercy, Dr. Webb. The body fails fast. But mine didn't. Mine held on too long, and I saw what's on the other side, and now I can't cross over because they won't let me. They marked me, they claimed me, and even though I'm dead, I'm not gone." His grip was tightening, my wrists going from numb to painful, bones grinding together, and I was genuinely terrified now, beyond shock, beyond rational assessment, in pure survival mode. I swung my right hand, still holding the phone, struck him across the temple with all the force I could manage from the awkward position. The phone shattered, screen going dark, plunging us back into complete darkness. But his grip loosened for just a second, just enough. I tore free, stumbled backward, fell over the wheeled stool I kept by the instrument tray. Hit the ground hard enough that the impact drove the air from my lungs. Scrambled backward on the floor, hands and feet, heading for where I knew the door had to be, gasping, unable to get enough air, panic making every breath insufficient. I found the door by running into it with my back. Reached up, found the handle, turned it. The door was locked. From the outside. That wasn't possible. Examination rooms don't lock from outside. Safety regulation, preventing accidental entrapment in sealed spaces with biological hazards. I yanked at the handle, threw my weight against it, achieved nothing. The door was solid, commercial grade, designed to contain whatever happened inside. I could hear him moving again, that dragging shuffle, coming toward me through the darkness. Closer. I was hammering on the door now, yelling, shouting for help, even though I knew the overnight security guard made rounds on the first floor and wouldn't hear me. Shouting anyway because the alternative was silence and the sound of approaching footsteps. "Please," his voice came from much closer than I thought, maybe 5 feet away, maybe less. "Please just listen. I need you to understand. I need someone to know what happened so when you find others like me, you'll understand what you're really seeing. I pressed myself against the door, wished desperately for any light, any ability to see. You're not real, I said, my voice shaking so badly I barely recognized it. You're dead. You're a hallucination, stress, carbon monoxide, something wrong with me but not with you because you're not here. I wish that were true, he said, and he sounded sad now, the desperation replaced by a profound grief that was somehow worse than the terror of the previous moments. I wish I was just neurons misfiring in your brain, Dr. Webb. That would be easier for both of us. But you know I'm real. You felt me. You can't hallucinate that kind of cold. He was right in front of me now. I could feel his presence, could feel the unnatural cold radiating from him, dropping the temperature even further. Could hear his breathing, that wet rhythmic sound that should not exist in lungs that no longer processed oxygen. What do you want? I managed to ask, the question coming out as barely more than a whisper. Tell them, he said. When you find the others, when you see the ones who died fighting, the ones whose faces show they saw something terrible in those last moments, tell people it's real. Tell them the door exists. Tell them some people see through it when they die. Tell them to be careful about what they look for in the darkness because sometimes the darkness looks back. I don't understand, I said, and I didn't. None of this made sense. None of this fit with anything I'd learned in 4 decades of medicine. You will, he said. Eventually, when it's your turn to stand at the edge and look through. You'll remember this moment and you'll understand what I tried to tell you. Then the lights came back on. Sudden, bright, harsh fluorescent illumination that made me squint and raise my hand against the glare. The examination room was empty except for me. The body was back on the table, lying exactly as I positioned it for the examination, paper sheet in place, no indication it had moved at all. The instruments were undisturbed on their tray. The temperature gauge on the wall showed 56 degrees, normal range, rising slowly as the system recovered from whatever glitch had affected it. And the door, when I reached up to try the handle, opened smoothly, unlocked, functioning normally. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, breathing hard, heart still racing, looking at the examination room that showed no evidence of the previous 5 minutes. No evidence except the shattered phone on the floor near the instrument tray and the deep bruises already forming around my left wrist, 5 distinct marks where fingers had gripped with impossible strength. Marks that would take weeks to fade and would make anyone who saw them ask questions I had no good answers for. I did not complete the examination that night. I locked examination room 3, logged a note that the case would be handled during the morning shift, cited equipment failure and contamination concerns. Went to my office and sat in the dark for 3 hours, waiting for sunrise, waiting for other people to arrive, waiting for the normal world to reassert itself and make what had happened feel less real. Detective Sanchez called at 8:15 asking for preliminary findings. I told her I needed more time, needed to run additional tests, would have something definitive by end of day. Spent the next week conducting the most thorough examination of my career, documenting every detail, running every test, looking for any explanation that fit within the boundaries of known medicine. The findings were mundane. Cardiac arrest triggered by cocaine overdose. The bruising was self-inflicted, caused by violent convulsions during the overdose, his own hands gripping his torso as the drug sent his heart into fatal arrhythmia. Not a murder, not an assault, just another young man who made a bad choice and paid the ultimate price. The case closed. John Doe was eventually identified through fingerprints as Michael Reeves, 32, from Riverside. History of drug use, no family that came forward to claim the body. He was cremated 6 weeks later at county expense. And I never spoke about what happened that night. Not to colleagues, not to friends, not even to the therapist I started seeing when the insomnia got so bad I was afraid to close my eyes. Because how do you explain that kind of experience? How do you tell people that a corpse grabbed you, spoke to you, delivered a message that suggested everything you know about death is incomplete? You don't. You bury it. You rationalize. You tell yourself it was stress, exhaustion, some kind of temporal lobe seizure that created a vivid hallucination consistent with your work environment. You go back to the daily routine, you conduct examinations, you sign death certificates, you maintain the professional facade. But you don't forget. You can't forget. That was 17 years ago. I've conducted hundreds of examinations since then, seen hundreds of faces frozen in death's final moment. And I pay attention now to the ones who died with their eyes open, with expressions of profound terror, with that particular quality of awareness that suggests they saw something in those final seconds that the rest of us will only see when our time comes. I wonder about them. Wonder what they witnessed. Wonder if they're still caught somehow in that space Michael Reeves described, that door between living and dead, unable to cross over because something on the other side marked them, claimed them, won't let them go. I'm retired now, but death doesn't stop interesting you just because you're no longer cutting open bodies professionally. And I'm 67, which means I'm statistically closer to finding out firsthand what happens, closer to approaching that threshold and discovering whether Michael Reeves was telling the truth or whether I experienced an elaborate breakdown that my brain constructed to process cumulative trauma. I suspect I'll know soon enough. We all will, eventually. But I'll tell you this, I believe him. Against all reason, against everything I was trained to accept, against the entire framework of materialist science that shaped my career, I believe that something happened in that examination room that November night. I believe I spoke with a dead man. I believe he was trapped somewhere between life and death, caught in a space that shouldn't exist but apparently does. And I believe he was trying to warn me about something, some reality about death that we don't acknowledge, don't teach in medical schools, don't include in the neat categories we use to make mortality manageable. The dead keep secrets. Sometimes they keep them past the point where secrets should be possible. And sometimes, rarely, they find a way to speak. I never worked alone with bodies again. Made up excuses, cited policy violations, arranged my schedule to ensure someone else was always present. Colleagues thought I was getting cautious in my old age, developing the kind of anxiety that sometimes hits doctors as they accumulate decades of exposure to human mortality. They weren't entirely wrong, but it wasn't about biological hazards or litigation concerns. It was about not wanting to be alone if a body decided to speak again, if another case came in where someone had looked through that door Michael described and seen something that wouldn't let them cross peacefully into whatever comes after. I examined thousands of bodies over 42 years, and exactly one of them moved, spoke, communicated after death. Statistical anomaly, hallucination, breakdown. Choose your explanation. But I felt his grip. I heard his words. I carry the scars, both the physical bruises that faded after weeks and the psychological ones that never will. And now I'm telling you, sharing this story that I've kept locked away for nearly 2 decades, because I'm old enough that keeping secrets feels less important than leaving some kind of testimony. Some kind of record that suggests the boundary between life and death might be stranger than we acknowledge. That the transition might not be instantaneous, might involve spaces and experiences we have no framework to understand. That the dead might not be quite as silent as we assume. You came here for a story about something strange that happened in a morgue, something that defies easy explanation. I've given you that. What you do with it, whether you file it under entertainment or consider the possibility that I'm describing something real, is up to you. But I'll offer one piece of advice, the same advice I've given myself every day since the November night. Pay attention to how you live. Pay attention to what you look for in the darkness. Because according to Michael Reeves, sometimes the darkness looks back. And if you see through that door before your body fails completely, You might find something waiting on the other side that doesn't want to let you go. The weeks following that encounter changed how I approach my work in ways both obvious and subtle. I maintained professional standards, conducted examinations with the same thoroughness, signed the same documents, attended the same meetings. But I was looking now, really looking, at the faces of the dead, searching for signs that someone had experienced what Michael described. That threshold moment where the door opened and they saw through before their body failed completely. It wasn't difficult to identify candidates. Maybe 1 in 20 bodies showed that particular configuration of features: eyes open wide, pupils maximally dilated, facial muscles locked in expressions that suggested horror or profound shock, hands sometimes raised in defensive postures or clutched against the chest. I'd always attributed these presentations to agonal processes, but bodies' final reflexive responses as systems shut down. Painful deaths often produce disturbing expressions. Cardiac events, strokes, traumatic injuries, all could leave the deceased looking as though they'd witnessed something terrible in those final moments. But now I wondered if some of them had seen something that wasn't purely internal, purely physiological. If some dying people really did glimpse whatever exists beyond the threshold and reacted not to pain or oxygen deprivation but to something observed, something waiting on the other side. I started documenting these cases more carefully. Not officially, not in ways that would show up in coroner's reports and raise questions about my mental state, but in private notes, in a journal I kept locked in my desk. I recorded details. Names, dates, circumstances of death, physical presentations, any unusual features of the examination. Looking for patterns, looking for commonalities, looking for anything that might support or refute what Michael had told me. The data was inconclusive. Some patterns emerged. Violent deaths seemed more likely to produce the disturbed expressions, but not exclusively. Some people who died peacefully in their sleep showed the same markers. Age didn't matter. Health history didn't predict it. Toxicology results didn't correlate. Whatever determined who saw through the door seemed random or followed rules I couldn't identify. But there were cases that bothered me. 3 in the first 6 months after Michael Reeves. Bodies that came in with similar presentations, profound bruising without corresponding external trauma, expressions of absolute terror, deaths that occurred when the person was alone and that defied easy medical explanation. Cardiac arrest was always the proximate cause. The heart stops, the person dies, case closed. But the question of why the heart stopped, what triggered the fatal arrhythmia in otherwise healthy people, remained frustratingly open. I tested for every toxin I could think of, examined tissue samples under microscopes, consulted with colleagues who specialized in cardiac pathology. Nothing definitive emerged. Just young to middle-aged people who died suddenly, violently, while alone, with injuries that suggested something had grabbed them, compressed their torsos, squeezed until internal organs ruptured and the heart gave out. The official reports listed cardiac arrest, added notes about possible undiagnosed conditions, closed the cases as deaths by natural causes complicated by unknown factors. But I knew, or I thought I knew. I thought these people had experienced what Michael experienced, had looked through the door while still alive, had seen something that reached back through and wouldn't let them go, had died not from internal medical failure but from external intervention, something crossing that threshold from the other side, something with the strength to crush human bodies and the interest to target people who had glimpsed it. I sound paranoid writing this. I sounded paranoid when I started thinking it, but I couldn't shake the pattern, couldn't ignore the similarities, couldn't rationalize away the memory of Michael's cold grip and desperate whisper. The dead were trying to tell me something, and I was one of the few people in a position to listen. So I kept documenting, kept looking, kept waiting for something more definitive. It came in March 1999, 4 months after Michael. Saturday morning, I was scheduled for a single examination, an elderly man who collapsed at a restaurant. Straightforward case. Witnesses saw him clutch his chest and fall. Paramedics worked on him for 20 minutes before pronouncing him dead at the scene. Classic cardiac event, the kind I'd seen hundreds of times. The body arrived, and I prepped for a routine examination. But when I reviewed the preliminary police report, something caught my attention. The man, Robert Chen, 73, had been dining alone. According to witnesses, just before he collapsed, he'd suddenly looked toward the empty chair across from him and said something. None of the witnesses could agree on the exact words, but several mentioned he seemed to be speaking to someone, seemed agitated, seemed to be responding to something only he could see. Then he grabbed his chest, stood up, and collapsed. I examined Mr. Chen's body with particular attention. Cardiac arrest confirmed. Massive myocardial infarction, the kind that's usually fatal even with immediate medical intervention. Nothing unusual in the toxicology. Nothing in his medical history that would explain sudden hallucinations or altered mental state before the heart attack. But his face showed that expression. Eyes wide, mouth open, features frozen in what looked like protest or denial. And when I examined his hands, I found faint bruising on the palms and fingers, the kind that suggested he'd been gripping something, holding on with desperate strength in those final moments. I was documenting these findings when I noticed something else. A mark on his left wrist, faint but visible under the examination lights. A bruise pattern that looked familiar, that looked like the marks I still carry from November. 5 distinct points of pressure, arranged like fingers, circling his wrist. I photographed it, measured it, tried to think of innocent explanations. He could have injured himself falling, could have grabbed his own wrist during the heart attack, could have developed the bruising from any number of sources in the hours before death. But I didn't believe those explanations. I believed Robert Chen had seen something at that restaurant, something sitting in the empty chair across from him. Believed he'd recognized what it meant, understood what was about to happen, tried to resist. And something had taken his wrist, had marked him the same way I'd been marked, had held him while his heart failed and his body died. I finished the examination, filed the report, released the body to his family. Standard procedure, standard documentation, nothing in the official record that would suggest I suspected anything beyond natural causes. But that night, I went home and stared at my journal, at the cases I'd been tracking, at the pattern that was becoming harder and harder to dismiss. These people weren't just dying, they were being taken. Something was crossing from wherever death leads, was reaching back into the living world, was marking people and claiming them and ensuring they didn't cross peacefully into whatever comes next. Michael had described being trapped, unable to move forward because something on the other side had marked him, claimed him. How many others were in the same situation? How many of the bodies I'd examined over my career had died that way, trapped in that in-between space, caught at the threshold with something holding them back? And more troubling, why? What existed beyond death that wanted to trap people, that prevented them from crossing over, that reached back into life to mark and claim? I had no framework for these questions. Medical school doesn't prepare you for ontological mysteries. Forensic pathology is about documenting physical evidence, determining cause of death, providing information for legal and medical purposes. It's not about metaphysics, not about what happens to consciousness after the body fails, not about whether death is a clean transition or something more complex and dangerous. But I was being confronted with evidence that suggested the simple materialist model was incomplete. That death involved more than biochemical processes stopping, more than neurons ceasing to fire and awareness dissolving into nothing. That there was a space, a threshold, a door that some people glimpsed when they died. And that something existed on the other side of that door, something capable of reaching back, something interested in claiming people who had seen it. I needed to know more. Needed information that medical journals and forensic textbooks wouldn't provide. So I started reading outside my field, started exploring literature on near-death experiences, on terminal lucidity, on historical accounts of deathbed visions. Most of it was either religious testimony or New Age speculation, neither of which helped me understand what I'd experienced in concrete terms. But patterns emerged across the accounts. People who came close to death often reported seeing something, a light, a tunnel, figures waiting. Most described it as peaceful, even welcoming. But some accounts were different. Some people who'd been resuscitated described seeing something terrible, something that had filled them with absolute dread, something they refused to describe in detail but that had left them terrified of dying. These accounts were usually dismissed as hallucinations, as the brain misfiring during trauma, as psychological responses to the fear of mortality. But what if they were accurate reports of something real? What if some people really did see through that door Michael described, really did glimpse something waiting on the other side, something that wasn't the peaceful transition we prefer to imagine? I found a neurologist, Dr. Sarah Lynn, who had published research on near-death experiences from a medical perspective. She was based at USC, and I reached out under the pretext of professional curiosity about consciousness during death. We met for coffee, and I carefully probed her findings. Most NDEs follow predictable patterns, she explained, stirring sugar into her cup. The experience is shaped by cultural expectations, by the person's beliefs about death, by the brain's attempt to create coherent narrative as systems fail. But there are outliers. Cases where people report experiences that don't fit the usual parameters, that seem to cause lasting psychological trauma rather than the peaceful acceptance we usually see. What kind of experiences? I asked, trying to sound academically curious rather than personally invested. Encounters with what they describe as entities or presences that felt malevolent. Sensations of being trapped or held against their will. One patient told me he felt like something was trying to pull him somewhere he desperately didn't want to go, and he fought to stay connected to his body until the medical team revived him. He described it as the most terrifying experience of his life. Did you believe him? I believe he experienced something that felt real to him, she said carefully. Whether it corresponded to any external reality is a different question. The brain under stress produces vivid experiences. But his physiological responses during the description, elevated heart rate, sweating, evident anxiety, suggested genuine trauma, not confabulation. Do you think consciousness survives death? I asked, abandoning pretense of detached curiosity. She studied me for a moment. I think we don't know enough about consciousness to make definitive statements. We can't explain how subjective experience arises from neural activity. We can't explain why awareness exists at all. So the question of what happens when the brain stops functioning is genuinely open. Medical science hasn't answered it, and anyone claiming certainty in either direction is overstepping the evidence. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was honest. And it suggested I wasn't completely insane for taking Michael's warning seriously, for considering the possibility that death involved more than simple cessation. I continued my research, continued tracking cases, continued looking for patterns in the bodies that came through the morgue. And I started taking precautions. I never worked alone anymore, always ensured someone else was present during examinations. I developed rituals, small behaviors that probably looked like superstition but that made me feel slightly safer. I wouldn't make eye contact with bodies that showed those particular expressions of terror. Wouldn't touch them more than necessary for the examination. Would complete the work as quickly as possible and get the body into cold storage, as if reducing exposure time reduced risk. My colleagues noticed the changes. A few asked if I was all right, if the job was getting to me after all these years. I deflected, made jokes about getting old, about becoming cautious as retirement approached. They accepted the explanations because people expect forensic pathologists to be a little strange, to develop quirks after decades of working with death. But I was increasingly convinced I was tracking something real, something dangerous, something that medical science had no framework to acknowledge. The dead weren't always peaceful. Some of them had died fighting. Some of them had seen through that door and encountered something that had marked them, claimed them, trapped them in that liminal space Michael described. And some of that, whatever it was, could still reach back into the living world when certain conditions were met. I didn't know what those conditions were. Didn't know why Michael's body had moved and spoken that November night, but others didn't. Didn't know why some people saw through the door and others apparently died without experiencing it. Didn't know if I was at risk, if having encountered Michael made me more visible to whatever existed on the other side. But I knew I was changed. Knew I couldn't approach death the same way anymore, couldn't maintain the professional detachment that had served me for decades, couldn't pretend the boundary between life and death was as simple and final as I'd been taught. I'd seen behind the curtain, and once you've seen, you can't unsee. That's the thing about knowledge that contradicts your fundamental assumptions about reality. You can't rationalize it away entirely. You can suppress it, distract yourself, fill your days with routine and normalcy. But it's always there, waiting in the quiet moments, reminding you that the world is stranger and more dangerous than you thought. 3 years after Michael Reeves grabbed my wrist in that examination room, I started planning my retirement. Not because I was old, but I was approaching 60 by then. Not because I was tired, but 4 decades of working with death does accumulate its own weight. But because I was afraid. Afraid that one night I'd be conducting an examination and another body would move, would speak, would deliver a message I wasn't prepared to hear. Afraid that I'd been marked somehow by that encounter, made visible to whatever existed beyond the threshold, and that returning attention was only a matter of time. Afraid that the next time something reached through from the other side, I wouldn't be able to pull away. I'd be the one trapped at the threshold, the one caught between life and death, the one future pathologist would examine while wondering why my face was locked in that particular expression of terror. Fear isn't a good reason to leave a career you've built over decades, but it's a powerful motivator nonetheless. I submitted my retirement paperwork in late 2014, set an exit date for spring 2015, started the process of extracting myself from the daily routine of the Los Angeles County Coroner's office. People threw parties, gave speeches, presented me with plaques commemorating my service. I smiled, thanked them, accepted the accolades while thinking about cold fingers wrapped around my wrist and a dead man's voice whispering desperate warnings in the dark. My last examination was in March 2015, a quiet case, an elderly woman who died peacefully in a nursing home. Natural causes, expected death, nothing unusual. I conducted the work with a younger pathologist observing, part of the knowledge transfer that happens when experienced doctors retire. I walked him through each step, explained the reasoning behind every decision, passed along the accumulated wisdom of 42 years. We finished. I signed the final report of my career, and I walked out of the examination room for the last time. I should have felt relief, should have felt the weight lifting, the burden of all those years with the dead finally releasing its grip. But I felt hollow, felt like I was abandoning something unfinished, leaving questions unanswered, walking away from a mystery that had consumed me for years. I went home that evening, poured a drink, sat in my living room as the sun set, and thought about all the bodies I'd examined. Thousands of people, each with their own story, their own moment of transition from life to death. How many had seen through that door? How many had encountered something waiting on the other side? How many had died trapped and terrified, unable to cross over, caught in that liminal space while their bodies were processed through the medical system and eventually disposed of according to protocol and law? I thought about Michael Reeves often in those first months of retirement. Wondered if he was still trapped, still caught at the threshold, still aware somehow despite his body being cremated years ago. Wondered if consciousness could persist without physical substrate, if whatever made someone them could continue existing in that in-between space even after the flesh was destroyed. No good answers emerged. Just questions, endlessly recursive, leading nowhere but to more uncertainty. I tried to settle into retirement, tried to find new routines, new purposes, new ways to structure days that no longer revolved around death and documentation. Traveled some, read extensively, maintained contact with a few colleagues. But the questions never left me, and the fear never completely faded. Because here's what I couldn't escape: I was getting older. Statistically closer to that threshold myself. Closer to the moment when I discover firsthand what Michael had tried to warn me about, when I'd see through that door and learn whether something was really waiting on the other side. I'm 67 now. Average life expectancy for an American male is around 76. I've got maybe a decade, maybe less, maybe more if I'm lucky and my genes cooperate. And I think about death differently than most people probably do. Not abstractly, not as some distant inevitability, but concretely, mechanically, as a process I understand in clinical detail but which apparently involves dimensions I never learned about in medical school. I wonder what I'll see when my time comes. Whether I'll glimpse that door Michael described. Whether something will be waiting there, something interested in claiming me, something that remembers the night I spoke with a dead man and has been watching ever since. I wonder if I'll die peacefully or if I'll die fighting, if my face will freeze in that expression of terror I've seen on so many bodies, if the pathologist who examines me will look at my presentation and wonder what I saw in those final moments. I hope for a clean death, quick and without awareness. Heart attack in my sleep, stroke that ends things before consciousness registers what's happening. The kind of death where you don't have time to see through the door, don't have time to encounter whatever waits there. But hope isn't much protection against reality. And reality, as I've learned, is considerably stranger than the neat materialist framework I operated under for most of my career. So I wait. Live my days. Try not to think too much about what comes next. But I remain aware, remain watchful, remain cognizant that the threshold I've studied from a safe professional distance is one I'll eventually have to cross personally. And when that time comes, when I'm lying somewhere dying, consciousness fading, systems failing, I'll remember Michael Reeves. Remember his cold grip, his desperate whisper, his warning about doors and darkness and things that wait and watch. I'll remember, and I'll know whether he was telling the truth, whether death really does involve a space between, a threshold where some people get trapped, a door that opens onto something stranger and more terrible than simple oblivion. I'll know, and there won't be anyone to tell about it afterward, no pathologist I can grab and warn, no way to pass along the information. Just me and whatever I encounter, alone at the threshold, discovering whether 42 years of working with death prepared me at all for the experience of dying. That's the fundamental isolation of mortality. We all cross alone. We all face that final transition without companionship, without guidance, without certainty about what awaits. We can theorize, can believe, can hope, but we can't know until we're there. And by then it's too late for the knowledge to help anyone else. So I live in uncertainty, retired but not released, free from the daily work with dead bodies but not free from the questions they raised. Knowing more than I want to about death but less than I need to feel comfortable approaching my own. It's not a good place to be, psychologically, but it's where Michael's warning left me. Aware of dimensions to death that I can't fully understand, can't prove to anyone else, can't integrate into a comfortable worldview. Just aware and waiting and hoping that when my turn comes, I'll cross cleanly and completely without lingering at that threshold, without encountering whatever trapped him in that space between life and death. That's all any of us can hope for, really. A clean crossing, a merciful end. Whatever comes after, May it be quick and may it leave us at peace rather than trapped and aware and desperate to warn the living about dangers they have no framework to understand. 10 years in retirement haven't brought clarity. If anything, I'm more uncertain now than when I left the coroner's office. Without the daily routine of examinations, without the structure of professional obligations, I've had too much time to think about what happened that November night in 1998. Too much time to question my memories, to wonder if Michael Reeves really grabbed me or if I experienced some kind of breakdown that my brain constructed into a narrative consistent with my work environment. The bruises I carry for weeks were real. I have photographs from the time, taken with a disposable camera I bought specifically to document the marks before they faded. 5 distinct points of pressure circling my left wrist, the pattern unmistakable. But bruises prove I was injured, not how the injury occurred. I could have done it to myself during a dissociative episode. Could have grabbed my own wrist with enough force to leave marks, created the entire narrative to explain self-inflicted trauma I didn't remember causing. Occam's razor would suggest that explanation. A hallucination plus self-harm is more plausible than a corpse reanimating, speaking, delivering warnings about metaphysical dangers. Any rational person would choose the psychological explanation over the supernatural one. But I felt him. Felt the cold, the impossible strength, the grip that was nothing like grabbing yourself feels. Felt his breath on my face, heard his voice forming words that came from outside my own thoughts. And I've examined enough bodies, conducted enough autopsies, developed enough expertise over 42 years to know the difference between a corpse and a living person. Michael Reeves was dead. No pulse, no respiration, no electrical activity in the brain. I'd confirmed it before I started the examination. And yet he moved, spoke, delivered a message that I'm still trying to fully understand 17 years later. The question that haunts me isn't whether it happened. I know it happened. The question is what it means. What does it suggest about death, about consciousness, about the transition from life to whatever comes after? If Michael was trapped at that threshold, if something on the other side had marked him and prevented him from crossing completely, what does that imply about the nature of death itself? Is it a process rather than an event? A journey rather than a light switch clicking off? And if some people get trapped during that process, unable to move forward but not able to return fully to life, what kind of existence are they experiencing? Are they conscious? Suffering? Aware of time passing while they remain frozen at the threshold? I've spent countless hours researching liminal states, reading philosophical and religious texts about the space between life and death. Bardo states in Tibetan Buddhism, purgatory in Catholic theology, the Egyptian concept of the do-it. Across cultures and time periods, humans have imagined death as involving transitional spaces, places the dead must pass through or navigate before reaching their final destination. I used to dismiss these as psychological projections, humans creating stories to manage the fear of mortality. But what if they're attempts to describe something real? What if people throughout history have encountered what Michael encountered, have seen through that door, have experienced the in-between space and tried to warn others using the religious and philosophical frameworks available to them? It would explain the consistency of the reports. The common themes of journeys, of trials, of entities encountered, of dangers faced. Not because these are universal archetypes emerging from the collective unconscious, but because they're descriptions of a real phenomenon, filtered through cultural lenses, translated into language that made sense to people who had no framework for describing what they'd experienced. I've tried to discuss these ideas with people, carefully, obliquely, not revealing my full thinking but testing whether anyone else has considered these possibilities. The responses range from polite dismissal to genuine concern about my mental health. Death is a biological event, I'm told. Consciousness is a product of brain activity. When the brain stops, the person ends. Full stop. No journey, no threshold, no entities waiting, just cessation. The materialist framework is comfortable. It makes death manageable, reduces it to a medical event we can document and process and move past. It allows us to function in a world where death is constant and unavoidable without confronting the existential terror of not knowing what happens to the eye that seems so continuous, so permanent, so essentially real throughout our lives. But comfort doesn't make something true, and the materialist framework fails to explain consciousness at all. We have no idea why neural activity produces subjective experience. We can map the correlations, can show which brain regions activate during which mental states, can demonstrate that damaging certain areas affects consciousness in predictable ways. But we can't explain the hard problem, why there's something it's like to be alive, why awareness exists, why we're not just unconscious biological machines processing stimuli without any inner life. If we can't explain consciousness during life, we certainly can't claim certainty about what happens to it after death. The honest position is agnosticism. We don't know. Can't know from this side of the threshold. Anyone claiming certainty, whether religious believers promising heaven or materialists promising oblivion, is overstepping the evidence. We're all working from theories and hopes and faith, not from knowledge. Michael Reeves claimed to have knowledge, claimed to have crossed far enough to see what waited on the other side, to encounter something that marked him and trapped him. I have to decide whether to believe him, whether to take his warning seriously or to dismiss it as the hallucination of a dying brain that I somehow shared through my own psychological breakdown. I choose to believe him, not because I have proof, not because I can defend the decision rationally, but because the alternative, that I experienced a psychotic break severe enough to create vivid hallucinations while leaving my professional functioning intact, seems less plausible than the possibility that death is stranger than we acknowledge. That makes me either wise or delusional. I won't know which until I die, and by then I won't be able to tell anyone. So I live with uncertainty. Try to make peace with the likelihood that I'll die without knowing for sure whether Michael was telling the truth. Try to focus on the life I'm still living rather than obsessing about the death I'm approaching. It's not easy. Every time I read about someone dying alone, dying suddenly, dying in circumstances that suggest they might have seen something in those final moments, I wonder if they encountered the same thing Michael encountered. Wonder if they're trapped now at that threshold, aware but unable to cross. Wonder if consciousness really does survive the body's death, at least temporarily, at least long enough to experience that in-between space. I'm tired of wondering, tired of questions without answers, tired of carrying this knowledge, if it is knowledge, alone because sharing it makes people question my sanity. I'm telling you now, recording this testimony, because I'm old enough that keeping secrets feels less important than leaving some kind of record. Some indication that maybe, possibly, death involves more than we typically acknowledge. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I experienced exactly the kind of stress-induced breakdown that any rational person would assume. Maybe you're listening to this and thinking about how sad it is that a respected forensic pathologist deteriorated into paranoid speculation about supernatural entities and liminal spaces. Maybe you're right to think that, but maybe I'm right. Maybe death really does involve a threshold, a door, a space where consciousness continues at least briefly after the body fails. Maybe some people see through that door and encounter something waiting. Maybe some of them get trapped, marked, claimed by whatever exists on the other side. And maybe, when your time comes, you'll remember what I've told you. Remember Michael Reeves' warning about being careful what you look for in the darkness because sometimes the darkness looks back. Remember that the expression on a dead person's face might tell you something about what they encountered in those final moments, something beyond pain or fear of dying. Remember that we don't actually know what death is, how it works, what happens to the eye that seems so essential to your experience of being alive. We have theories. We have beliefs. We have hopes and fears and cultural narratives, but we don't have knowledge. Not really. And until you're standing at that threshold yourself, consciousness fading, systems failing, you won't know whether I'm telling you the truth about what happened in that examination room in November 1998 or whether I'm sharing the delusions of an old man who spent too long working with death and eventually let it corrupt his thinking. I hope you never encounter what Michael encountered. Hope you cross cleanly when your time comes. Hope there's no door to see through, no in-between space to navigate, no entities waiting to mark and claim you. Hope death is simple cessation, consciousness ending as the brain stops, nothing after but the same nothing that existed before you were born. That would be merciful. That would be clean. But I don't think that's what happens. I think Michael was telling the truth. And I think I'll find out for certain soon enough. We all will. That's the one absolute certainty in this uncertain existence. We're all heading toward that threshold, and we'll all discover what waits on the other side. I just hope I'm wrong about what's there. Hope that when I see through that door, I'll find something peaceful rather than something that reaches back, something that marks, something that traps people in that space between life and death. Hope that my last moments won't be spent fighting, terrified, or that I'm being claimed by something I have no power to resist. But hope isn't knowledge. And I've learned, over 42 years of working with the dead and 17 years of thinking about one particular dead man who grabbed my wrist in the dark, that reality doesn't much care what we hope for. Reality simply is. And sometimes it's stranger and darker than anything we want to believe. That's what Michael tried to tell me. That's the warning I'm passing along to you. Not because I want to frighten you. Not because I enjoy sharing disturbing possibilities about death and what comes after. But because I think you deserve to know that the materialist framework, the comfortable story that death is just biological cessation, nothing to fear beyond the pain of dying, might be incomplete. Might be leaving out dimensions of experience that some people encounter, that some people see, that some people get trapped in. You make your own decisions about what to believe. Most people will dismiss this as the rambling of an old man whose mind has been warped by too much exposure to death. That's reasonable. That's rational. That's probably the smart choice. But keep it in the back of your mind. Remember it when you're old, when death is approaching, when you're starting to think seriously about what might come after. Remember Michael Reeves. Remember the man who grabbed a pathologist's wrist in the dark and whispered about doors and thresholds and things that wait and mark and trap. Remember that we don't actually know what death is. And remember to be careful what you look for in the darkness. Because according to a dead man who spoke to me 17 years ago, sometimes the darkness looks back. And if it sees you, if it marks you, you might find yourself trapped at that threshold, unable to cross over, unable to return, just caught in that in-between space while your body is processed and disposed of and life continues for everyone else. That's the horror Michael described. Not physical pain, not oblivion, but awareness without release, consciousness trapped in a space where it shouldn't be able to persist, where it has no body to operate through but hasn't been allowed to dissipate into whatever comes next. If that's real, and I believe it might be, then death is potentially worse than anything we typically imagine. Because at least oblivion would be merciful. At least ending would be final. But if consciousness can persist past the body's death, if it can be trapped in that liminal space, if something exists on the other side that has the power and interest to claim people and hold them there, then death becomes not an ending but a transition into something potentially far worse than life. I don't know if that's true. I can't prove it. Can't even articulate exactly what I think is happening based on one encounter with a dead man who moved and spoke and delivered a warning I'm still trying to fully understand. But I believe something happened that night that doesn't fit into conventional medical understanding. Something that suggests death is more complex, more dangerous, more mysterious than the clean biological process I was trained to see it as. And I'm telling you because keeping this knowledge to myself feels like a betrayal. If there's any chance Michael was telling the truth, if there's any possibility that some people really do get trapped at the threshold between life and death, then others should know, should have the chance to prepare, to be cautious, to pay attention to what they look for in the darkness. Will it help? I don't know. Michael didn't tell me how to avoid what happened to him. Didn't offer strategies for crossing cleanly. Just warned me that the door exists, that something waits on the other side, that some people see through it and get trapped there. That's all I can pass along. A warning without instructions. Knowledge without power. The information that death might be stranger than you think, accompanied by absolutely no guidance about what to do with that information. I'm sorry it's not more useful. Sorry I can't offer certainty or comfort or clear direction. But I've spent 17 years thinking about this, researching, looking for answers, and I've found nothing but more questions. So I'm giving you what I have. One pathologist's testimony about one impossible encounter with one dead man who delivered one warning that I've never been able to forget. Take from it what you will. Believe it or dismiss it. File it under entertainment or consider it seriously. Your choice. But don't say you weren't warned. Don't say no one told you that death might involve more than simple biological cessation. Don't say you had no reason to suspect that consciousness might persist past the body's failure, that thresholds might exist, that something might wait on the other side capable of marking and claiming and trapping. Because I've told you. Right now, in this testimony, I've shared what Michael Reeves shared with me in that examination room in November 1998. I've passed along the warning he gave me at such desperate cost, delivered through lips that should never have moved again, spoken in a voice that should have been permanently silenced by death. I've done what I can to prepare you for the possibility that when your time comes, when you're dying and consciousness is fading and systems are failing, you might see something. Might glimpse through a door that opens at the moment of transition. Might encounter something waiting there. And I've warned you that if you do, if you see through that door while you're still alive enough to be aware, you might find yourself marked, claimed, trapped in that space between life and death, unable to cross over, unable to return, just caught there with something holding you back from whatever comes next. That's the horror Michael described. That's what he was trying to warn me about. That's what I'm warning you about now. May you never experience it. May your death be clean and quick and merciful, consciousness ending before you have time to see through that door, before you have time to encounter whatever waits there. But if you do see it, if you find yourself at that threshold aware and looking through to the other side, remember this testimony. Remember that at least one other person, maybe two, if you count Michael Reeves, encountered the same thing. And know that you're not alone in that experience, even if you're absolutely alone in every other way that matters. That's all I can offer. Testimony. Warning. The knowledge that you're not the first to see what you're seeing if you happen to glimpse through that door. It's not much, but it's everything I have to give. Everything I learned from 42 years of working with death and one impossible encounter that changed how I understand the final transition we all must make. I'm 67 years old. Statistically, I don't have much time left. Maybe a decade, maybe less. Maybe I'll make it to 80 if I'm lucky. But eventually, probably sooner than I prefer, I'm going to face that threshold myself. Going to discover firsthand whether Michael was telling the truth. Going to learn what waits on the other side of that door he described. And I'm afraid. Not of pain. I've seen enough traumatic deaths to know that pain usually ends quickly, that the body has mechanisms for shutting down awareness once trauma exceeds certain thresholds. Not afraid of pain. Afraid of awareness. Afraid of seeing through that door and encountering what Michael encountered. Afraid of being marked, claimed, trapped in that liminal space while my body is examined and processed and eventually destroyed. Afraid of consciousness persisting past the point where it should end, trapped and aware and unable to communicate, unable to cross over, just caught forever in that space between life and death. That's the fate I fear. That's the fate Michael suggested was possible. And that's the fate I'm hoping to avoid through nothing more substantial than hope, because I have no other strategy, no other defense, no other preparation beyond awareness that it might happen. So I live in fear. Quiet fear, manageable fear, fear that doesn't prevent me from functioning but that colors everything, especially now that I'm old enough to feel mortality approaching. Fear that when my time comes, I won't cross cleanly, won't get the merciful death I'm hoping for, will instead find myself in the situation Michael described, trapped and aware and desperate to warn someone who can't hear me. I don't want to die that way. Don't want my last moments to be spent fighting something I can't resist, being pulled towards something I don't want to encounter, being marked and claimed by whatever exists on the other side of that threshold. But wanting doesn't matter. Fear doesn't matter. When death comes, it comes on its own terms, following its own logic, indifferent to our preferences about how we'd like the transition to occur. All I can do is hope. Hope that Michael's experience was unique, an anomaly, not representative of what typically happens. Hope that most people cross cleanly without encountering what he encountered. Hope that when my turn comes, I'll be one of the lucky ones who dies quickly, consciousness ending before I have time to see through that door. Hope that whatever waits on the other side has no interest in me, won't mark me, won't claim me, will let me pass through to whatever comes next without interference. It's not much of a plan, but it's all I have. Hope, and the testimony I'm leaving behind. Hope for myself that I'll avoid Michael's fate. And testimony for others that the fate exists, that death might be stranger than we acknowledge, that consciousness might persist past the body's failure in ways that are potentially far worse than simple oblivion. That's my legacy from 42 years of working with the dead and 17 years of thinking about one dead man who grabbed my wrist and whispered warnings I'm still trying to fully understand. I've spent my professional life studying death, documenting it, trying to understand what it is and how it works. And I've learned that I don't understand it at all. That the confident materialism I operated under for most of my career was a comfortable fiction, a simplification that allowed me to function but that bore little relationship to the actual mystery of consciousness and its cessation. Death isn't simple, isn't clean, isn't just biological processes stopping and consciousness winking out. It's something stranger, something more complex, something that involves dimensions we don't have good frameworks for understanding. I know that now, learned it the hard way, from direct experience that I can't rationalize away no matter how much more comfortable the rational explanations would be. And I'm telling you so that you know it too. So that when you think about death, when you contemplate your own mortality, when you wonder what happens after, you remember that a forensic pathologist with 4 decades of experience once told you he encountered something that defied everything he'd been trained to believe. Something that suggested death involves thresholds and doors and entities that mark and claim and trap. Something that made him afraid of his own approaching death in ways he'd never been afraid before. You can dismiss it, can file it under delusion or fabrication or the deterioration of an aging mind. That's reasonable. That's probably what most people will do. But some of you will remember, will keep it in the back of your mind. We'll think about it when you're old, when death is approaching, when you're wondering what comes next. And maybe, when your time comes, maybe when your dying and consciousness is fading, you'll remember Michael Reeves' warning about being careful what you look for in the darkness. About how sometimes the darkness looks back. And maybe that memory will help somehow. Will prepare you. Will make you cautious. Will give you some small advantage in navigating the threshold if you happen to encounter it. I hope so. I hope this testimony serves some purpose beyond allowing me to finally share the burden of knowledge I've carried alone for 17 years. I hope that by speaking about it, by recording what happened and what I think it means, I'm doing something useful rather than just indulging in morbid speculation. But useful or not, it's done. I've told you everything. Shared the experience, shared my interpretation, shared the fear it's left me with. Passed along Michael's warning to the best of my ability. The rest is up to you. What you believe, how you prepare, what you do with the information that death might be stranger than you thought. I can't control any of that. Can't force you to take it seriously. Can only offer the testimony and hope that somewhere, somehow, it helps someone navigate that final threshold a little more successfully than Michael Reeves did. That's all I want. Some small positive outcome from a terrifying experience. Some indication that his death and his desperate warning and my 17 years of fear and uncertainty weren't completely meaningless. Some suggestion that knowledge, even disturbing, unverifiable knowledge, is better than ignorance when it comes to the most fundamental transition any of us will face. Death is coming for all of us. That's certain. How we face it, what we encounter, whether we cross cleanly or get trapped at the threshold, that's uncertain, unknown, unpredictable. But now you know it's a possibility. Know that at least one person encountered something at the threshold that was terrible enough to make him fight death even though his body was already failing. Terrible enough that he managed somehow to reach back from beyond death to deliver a warning. Terrible enough that an experienced forensic pathologist changed his entire approach to working with the dead after one encounter with something that shouldn't have been possible. Know that, and remember it. Remember it when your time comes. Remember it when you're dying. Remember it when consciousness is fading and you're approaching that final threshold. And if you see through the door, if you glimpse something waiting on the other side, remember that you're not alone in that experience. That others have seen it too, and that at least one old pathologist believed you weren't hallucinating, weren't imagining it, weren't experiencing random neural noise as your brain shut down. It's real, or at least it might be real, and that possibility is worth taking seriously, worth preparing for as much as anyone can prepare for an experience that lies completely outside normal human experience. I've done what I can to prepare you. Shared what I know, warned you about what might await, encouraged caution about what you look for in the darkness. The rest is beyond my control. Beyond anyone's control, really. Death follows its own rules, operates according to logic we don't fully understand, leads to destinations we can't map from this side of the threshold. All we can do is live as well as we can, make peace with our mortality as much as possible, and hope that when our time comes, the crossing will be gentle. That consciousness will fade before we see too much. That whatever waits on the other side will have no interest in marking us, claiming us, trapping us in that liminal space Michael described. That's my hope for you. That's my hope for myself. That's my hope for everyone who will eventually face that final transition. May your death be merciful. May your crossing be clean. May you never encounter what Michael Reeves encountered in those final moments when his body failed but his consciousness remained aware long enough to see through the door and glimpse what waited on the other side. And if you do encounter it, if you find yourself at that threshold looking through to something terrible, remember that you were warned. Remember that you're not the first. Remember that the darkness sometimes looks back, and that being seen by it carries consequences we don't fully understand but that appear to involve consciousness persisting in ways and places it shouldn't be able to persist. That's the final warning. That's the complete testimony. That's everything I learned from one impossible night in November 1998 when a dead man grabbed my wrist and pulled me close enough to whisper secrets about death that have haunted me ever since. I've carried this knowledge alone for 17 years. Now I've shared it. The burden is lighter for me, distributed among everyone who's heard this testimony. And maybe, somewhere in that distribution, someone will find it useful. Will take the warning seriously. Will be cautious at that final threshold. Will cross cleanly because they were prepared for the possibility that death involves more than simple biological cessation. That would be enough. That would make the fear and uncertainty and isolation of the past 17 years worthwhile. that would give meaning to Michael's desperate warning and my impossible experience and all the years I've spent wondering whether I'm sane or delusional, whether I encountered something real or experienced a psychological break so severe it fundamentally changed how I understand reality. I still don't know which. Won't know until I die. But I've made my peace with uncertainty as much as anyone can. I've lived with these questions long enough that they become part of who I am, part of my daily experience, part of the lens through which I view the world. Death isn't simple. That's the core truth, the fundamental insight. The one thing I'm absolutely certain about after 42 years of professional experience and 17 years of personal contemplation. Death isn't simple, isn't clean, isn't just biological processes stopping and consciousness ending. It's something stranger. Something that involves dimensions we don't acknowledge, spaces we don't map, entities we don't name because we have no framework for understanding what they are or how they operate. I know that now. Learned it from a dead man who shouldn't have been able to teach me anything. And I'm passing it along because knowledge, even disturbing, incomplete, unverifiable knowledge, seems better than ignorance when it comes to the most fundamental transition any conscious being must eventually make. You're going to die. I'm going to die. Everyone listening to this will die. That's absolute certainty in an uncertain world. What happens when we die? That's the question. The question I spent 4 decades thinking I knew the answer to. The question Michael Reeves forced me to reconsider. The question I'll only truly answer when my own time comes and I discover firsthand whether his warning was accurate or whether I spent 17 years afraid of something that doesn't exist. I'll find out soon enough. We all will. And when I do, when I'm standing at that threshold looking through the door Michael described, I'll think about this testimony, about the warning I tried to give, about the knowledge I attempted to share despite having no proof, no certainty, nothing but one impossible experience in 17 years of thought. I'll think about it, and I'll hope I prepared you as well as Michael prepared me. Gave you enough information to be cautious without giving you so much fear that it poisons your remaining life. Warned you about possibilities without making death seem so terrible that you spend your days dreading it rather than living fully. That's the balance I've tried to strike. Warning without overwhelming. Information without inducing paralysis. The truth, or what I believe to be the truth, delivered as gently as such disturbing content can be delivered. I hope I've succeeded. Hope this testimony helps rather than harms. Hope that by speaking about my experience and my fears and my interpretation of what happened, I've done something useful for whoever hears these words. But I can't control outcomes. Can't determine how you'll receive this information or what you'll do with it. Can only offer it as honestly as I'm able and trust that some good will come from sharing what I know. So here we are, at the end of my testimony. At the conclusion of everything I can tell you about death and thresholds and things that wait and mark and trap. I'm Dr. Marcus Webb. I spent 42 years as a forensic pathologist, examining thousands of bodies, documenting thousands of deaths, learning the mechanics of how human life ends. And I learned that I didn't understand death at all. That despite all my training and experience and expertise, the fundamental nature of that final transition remained mysterious, remained unknown, remained something I'd only truly understand when I experienced it myself. That time is approaching. I'm 67. My health is reasonable but not perfect. Heart disease runs in my family. I've got arthritis, high blood pressure, the usual accumulation of age-related conditions. Statistically, I've got somewhere between 5 and 15 years remaining. Maybe more if I'm lucky. Maybe less if I'm not. And when that time comes, when I'm dying and approaching that threshold I've spent so many years thinking about, I'll remember Michael Reeves. Remember the cold grip of his hand around my wrist. Remember his desperate whisper in the darkness of that examination room. Remember the warning he gave me about doors and darkness and things that Mark can claim. I'll remember, and I'll be cautious. I'll try not to look for anything in that final darkness. I'll try to cross quickly, cleanly, without lingering at the threshold long enough to see through the door he described. I'll try, but I don't know if trying will be enough. Don't know if we have any control over how we die, over what we experience in those final moments, over whether we see through that door or cross blindly into whatever comes next. All I can do is hope. Hope for mercy. Hope for a quick death that doesn't give me time to see too much. Hope that whatever exists on the other side of that threshold has no interest in me, no reason to mark me, no desire to trap me in that liminal space where consciousness persists but the body is gone. Hope, and the small comfort of knowing I've done what I could to warn others, to share what I learned, to pass along Michael's message to anyone willing to listen. That's all any of us can do in the face of mortality. Live as well as we can. Prepare as much as possible. Hope for mercy when the end comes. And try to leave something useful behind. Knowledge, warning, testimony for those who come after. I've lived. I've prepared. I'm hoping. And I've left this testimony as the most useful thing I can offer given what I know and what I've experienced. The rest is silence. The rest is waiting. The rest is the slow approach of that final threshold and the uncertainty about what I'll encounter when I reach it. May you fare better than I fear I will. May your crossing be clean. May you never encounter what Michael encountered or experience what I'm afraid I'll experience when my time comes. May death be simple for you. May it be quick. May it be merciful. May it involve no doors, no entities, no marking or claiming or trapping in spaces between life and whatever comes after. That's my final hope for you. That's my farewell. That's the conclusion of testimony I've spent 17 years preparing to give and the rest of my life dreading having to deliver. Be careful what you look for in the darkness. Sometimes the darkness looks back. And if it sees you, if it marks you, you may find that death is not an ending but a beginning of something far worse than anything you imagined. Michael Reeves tried to warn me. I've tried to warn you. The warning has been given. The knowledge has been shared. The testimony is complete. What you do with it is up to you. How you face your own mortality, how you approach that final threshold, how you navigate whatever you encounter there, that's beyond my control. Beyond anyone's control. We're all alone in that final transition, all facing it without guidance, without certainty, without knowing what waits until we're there experiencing it firsthand. I just hope that by sharing what I know, by passing along Michael's warning, by testifying to my experience and my fears and my interpretation of what it all means, I've given you something useful, some small advantage. Some preparedness for possibilities you might not have considered. That's the best I can offer, the most I can give, the only legacy I can leave from a career spent studying death and one impossible encounter that taught me how little I actually understood about what I'd spent 4 decades examining. I'm Dr. Marcus Webb. I examined the dead for 42 years, and I learned that they keep secrets even past the point where secrets should be possible. Sometimes they find ways to speak. And when they do, when they reach back from beyond death to deliver warnings about what waits on the other side, it's worth listening. I listened to Michael Reeves. I've passed along his warning, and now I'm waiting to discover whether he was telling the truth, whether death really does involve doors and thresholds and things that mark and claim, whether consciousness really can persist past the body's failure, trapped in liminal spaces, unable to cross over. I'll know soon. We all will, eventually. And when I find out, when I'm standing at that threshold experiencing whatever Michael tried to warn me about, I'll think about this testimony one last time. I'll think about whether I succeeded in warning you adequately, whether my words will help anyone navigate that final transition more successfully than I'm likely to. Whether sharing my fear and knowledge and uncertainty will make any difference at all when you're facing your own death and encountering whatever waits at that threshold. I hope so. I hope this helps. I hope that somewhere, somehow, this testimony makes the crossing easier for someone, makes them cautious when caution matters, prepares them for possibilities they wouldn't have considered otherwise. That would be enough. That would make everything worthwhile. The fear, the isolation, the years of uncertainty, the difficulty of living with knowledge that contradicts everything I was trained to believe. If it helps even one person navigate that final threshold more successfully, then speaking about it was the right choice. Sharing my experience was justified. Breaking the silence about what happened in that examination room in November 1998 served a purpose beyond my own need to finally tell someone after 17 years of carrying it alone. So I'll hope for that. Hope that this testimony helps. Hope that Michael's warning, delivered at such desperate cost and carried by me through so many years of fear and doubt, reaches someone who needs it. Someone who will remember it when it matters most. That's all I can do now. I've spoken. I've shared. I've warned as clearly as I'm able given the incomplete and disturbing nature of what I know. The rest is up to death itself, and to whatever waits on the other side of that threshold we'll all eventually cross. May it be merciful to you. May your crossing be clean. May you never learn firsthand whether Michael Reeves was telling the truth about what he encountered in that space between life and death. And if you do encounter it, if you find yourself at that threshold looking through the door he described, remember that you were warned. Remember that the darkness sometimes looks back. Remember that being seen carries consequences. And remember to cross as quickly as you can, without lingering, without looking too long at whatever waits on the other side. That's the warning. That's the testimony. That's everything I can tell you after 42 years of working with death and 17 years of living with one impossible encounter that changed everything I thought I knew. Dr. Marcus Webb, forensic pathologist, retired. Signing off for the final time. Waiting for that threshold. Hoping for mercy. Afraid I won't receive it. May you fare better than I fear I will. May death be kind to you in ways I suspect it won't be kind to me. And may you never, ever encounter what Michael Reeves encountered when he looked through that door and saw what was waiting. Be careful in the darkness. Sometimes it looks back. And if it sees you, everything changes. That's the final warning. The last words. The end of testimony. Whatever comes next, you've been prepared as well as I could prepare you. The rest is silence and waiting and that inevitable approach toward the threshold we all must cross. Good luck. Be cautious. Die well. That's all I can offer. All anyone can offer in the face of mortality and uncertainty and the terrible possibility that death is stranger and darker than anything we're willing to acknowledge. The testimony is complete. The warning has been given. The rest is up to you, and to death, and to whatever waits when consciousness finally fails and we discover what exists on the other side of that final threshold. May it be nothing. May it be peace. May it be quick and merciful and clean. But if it's not, if you find yourself trapped at that threshold, marked and claimed and unable to cross, at least you'll know you're not the first. That Michael Reeves was there before you. That Dr. Marcus Webb spent 17 years afraid he'd join you there. Small comfort, perhaps. But it's all the comfort I have to offer given what I know and what I fear and what I suspect awaits when my time finally comes. This is Dr. Webb, signing off, waiting, hoping, afraid, and wishing you better fortune than I expect when we all eventually face that darkness and discover whether it's really looking back. I've been retired for 10 years now, and the fear hasn't diminished. If anything, it's grown sharper as I've aged, as the statistical probability of my own death has increased with each passing year. Every morning when I wake, there's a moment of relief that I made it through another night. Every time I feel chest pain or shortness of breath, there's a spike of terror that has nothing to do with the physical discomfort and everything to do with what might be waiting on the other side. I've tried to live well in these retirement years. Tried to make peace with what's coming. tried to focus on the life I still have rather than the death I'm approaching. But it's difficult when you carry the knowledge I carry, when you've experienced what I've experienced, when you believe, truly believe, that consciousness might persist past the body's failure in ways that are potentially worse than any conventional hell imagined by religion. Because that's what Michael described, really. A kind of hell. Not fire and brimstone, not punishment for sins, but something worse, awareness without release, consciousness trapped in a liminal space, unable to move forward or back, just suspended in that threshold space while something on the other side holds you there. Marks you, claims you, keeps you from crossing into whatever merciful oblivion or peaceful afterlife might await those who die cleanly. How many people are trapped there right now? How many of the bodies I examined over 42 years died that way, seeing through the door, getting marked, remaining aware even as their physical forms were cut open and catalogued and eventually destroyed? The thought keeps me awake at night. The possibility that consciousness survived in those bodies even as I was conducting examinations, that somewhere some aspect of them was still present, still aware, still experiencing everything being done to them but unable to communicate, unable to move, unable to do anything but observe and suffer. I tell myself that's impossible. That even if consciousness persists briefly after death, it can't remain tethered to a body that's being systematically dismantled. That whatever trapped state Michael described must release eventually, must allow the consciousness to dissipate or cross over or simply cease. Otherwise the implications are too horrific to contemplate. But I don't know. Can't know. Have no framework for understanding how consciousness could persist without a functioning brain, much less how long it could persist or what would finally allow it to end or transition. These are the questions that haunt me. These are the thoughts that fill my days and disturb my sleep and make retirement feel less like freedom and more like waiting. Waiting for my turn. Waiting to discover what's true. Waiting to learn whether my fear is justified or whether I've spent 17 years terrified of something that either doesn't exist or is far less terrible than I imagined. I've considered seeking help, therapy, medication, anything that might reduce the anxiety and let me live my remaining years with more peace. But how do you explain this to a therapist? How do you describe experiencing something impossible? Something that contradicts everything you were trained to believe, something that's left you afraid of the one absolute certainty in human existence. I spoke with a corpse and now I'm terrified of dying sounds like the complaint of someone experiencing a severe psychotic break. Any reasonable mental health professional would suggest antipsychotics, would want to explore family history of schizophrenia, would try to help me understand that what I experienced was a hallucination that I've given too much credence to. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe I should take that route. Maybe medicating away the fear and the memory and the belief would let me live my remaining years more fully. Maybe choosing comfortable delusion over uncomfortable possibility would be the wise choice at this stage of life. But I can't do it. Can't abandon the memory of Michael's cold grip. Can't dismiss the warning he delivered, can't pretend the experience was anything other than what I believe it was, genuine contact with something that shouldn't have been possible, genuine information about death that contradicts everything I was taught. So I live with fear, live with uncertainty, live with the knowledge that I'm approaching a threshold that might be far more dangerous than most people realize. And I wait for signs that death is approaching. Wait for the moment while I have to face what I've been dreading for 17 years. Wait to discover whether Michael was telling the truth or whether I'm about to die afraid of nothing. The waiting is its own form of torture. Every day that passes is one day closer. Every minor health issue could be the beginning of the cascade that leads to death. Every morning could be the last morning I wake up. Every night could be the night when my heart finally fails or my brain finally strokes or whatever biological catastrophe is waiting finally arrives. I find myself paying attention to patterns. Days when I feel weaker, when my thinking seems less sharp, when my body reminds me in small ways that it's aging and failing and approaching its limits. Are these just normal fluctuations? Or are they warning signs that the final decline is beginning? I've started keeping detailed health logs. Blood pressure, pulse, weight, sleep quality, cognitive function tests I've designed for myself. Looking for trends, looking for decline, looking for advance warning that death is approaching so I'm not caught by surprise, so I have time to prepare as much as anyone can prepare for an experience that's fundamentally beyond preparation. It's obsessive behavior, I know. It's the kind of thing that would concern anyone who knew about it. But I can't stop. Can't just passively wait for death to arrive. Need to feel like I have some measure of control, some ability to see it coming, some capacity to prepare even though I have no idea what preparation would actually look like. What do you do to prepare for the possibility that your consciousness might persist past your body's death? How do you steel yourself for the chance that you'll see through a door into something terrible, that you'll be marked and claimed and trapped in a liminal space while your physical form is processed and destroyed? Prayer? I've tried it, despite not being religious, despite having spent most of my life operating under a materialist framework. Desperate times and all that. But the words feel empty, feel like speaking into void, feel like superstition rather than genuine communication with anything real. Meditation? I've attempted that too. Tried to cultivate acceptance of death, tried to prepare my consciousness for dissolution or transition or whatever might come. But meditation practices assume death is either ending or peaceful transcendence. None of them address the possibility that you might see through a door into something that wants to trap you, something that will mark you and claim you and hold you in that threshold space. Philosophy? I've read everything I can find about death, about consciousness, about the nature of being and ending. The materialists say consciousness is purely physical, that when the brain stops, awareness stops, that death is simply cessation. The dualists suggest consciousness might be separate from physical substrate, might persist or transition to something else. The religious offer various afterlife scenarios, most of them involving judgment and reward or punishment. None of it addresses what Michael described. None of it accounts for the possibility of liminal spaces, of thresholds where consciousness gets trapped, of entities that mark and claim and prevent clean crossing. It's like everyone throughout history has been theorizing about death while missing or ignoring a crucial dimension of the experience. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Michael's experience was unique, an anomaly, not representative of what normally happens. Maybe the vast majority of people die cleanly, cross without incident, never encounter whatever he encountered. Maybe I'm terrified of something that affects one person in a million that I'm statistically unlikely to experience. But how can I know? How can anyone know until they die? And by then it's too late for the knowledge to provide any comfort or to help with preparation. So I remain in uncertainty, remain in fear, remain obsessively documenting my health and thinking about death and dreading the approach of that final threshold. It's no way to live. I know that. Spending your remaining years terrified of the ending rather than embracing the time you have left is a waste, a tragedy, a failure to make use of the gift of continued existence. But knowing I should live differently doesn't give me the tools to actually do it. Doesn't remove the fear. Doesn't let me forget Michael's cold grip or his desperate whisper or the warning that has defined the last 17 years of my life. I'm trapped, in a sense. Trapped by knowledge I can't verify, trapped by fear I can't rationalize away, trapped by an experience I can't forget or dismiss. Trapped while still alive in much the way Michael suggested consciousness could be trapped after death, aware but unable to move forward, unable to go back, just suspended in a state that's neither fully one thing nor the other. The irony isn't lost on me. I've become in life what I fear I'll become in death, caught at a threshold, unable to cross fully into acceptance or peace, held back by something I can't see or touch or fight. Maybe that's my punishment for whatever role I played in what happened to Michael. Maybe by examining his body, by being the one present when he reached back from death to deliver his warning, I became connected to whatever trapped him. Maybe I'm already marked, already claimed, already certain to experience what he experienced regardless of how carefully I try to navigate that final threshold. I don't know. Can't know. Add it to the list of things I'll only understand while I'm dying, when it's too late for the knowledge to help. What I do know is that I'm tired. Tired of fear. Tired of uncertainty. Tired of carrying this burden alone. Tired of wondering every day whether this will be the day my health fails and I have to face what I've been dreading. Tired enough that sometimes, more often lately, I wonder if I should just face it. Should stop waiting for death to arrive naturally and instead take control of the timing. Choose when and how rather than letting biology and chance determine it. I haven't acted on those thoughts. Haven't even come close. But they're there, present at the edges of my thinking, growing louder as I age and as the waiting becomes harder to endure. Would choosing the timing give me any advantage? Would knowing the moment was approaching let me prepare better, let me face the threshold with more readiness? Or would it just mean experiencing the terror sooner, experiencing it while I still had time to change my mind but choosing not to? I genuinely don't know. Don't even know if I'm capable of making that choice. 42 years of working to preserve life, to document death so that the living could find meaning or justice or closure, it's left me with deep instincts against self-harm, against choosing death over continued existence. But the instinct to continue living wars with the desire to stop waiting, to stop fearing, to finally know what's true rather than living in this perpetual state of anxious uncertainty. Most days, the instinct to continue living wins. Most days, I'm glad to wake up, glad to have another day of existence despite the fear that colors it. Most days, I'm not ready to face that threshold regardless of how tired I am of waiting. But some days, more of them lately, I wonder if continuing to wait is really the better choice. Wonder if prolonging this existence of fear and uncertainty is actually more suffering than whatever I might encounter if I just faced it and got it over with. These are dark thoughts. Dangerous thoughts. Thoughts I shouldn't be having and definitely shouldn't be sharing. But this testimony is meant to be complete, meant to be honest, meant to capture not just what happened in that examination room, but what it's done to me in the years since. And what it's done is break something fundamental in how I relate to my own mortality. I'm not afraid of death in the normal way people fear it, afraid of pain, afraid of loss, afraid of the end of experience and relationship and all the things that make life valuable. I'm afraid of something else, something worse. Afraid that death isn't an ending at all but a transition into a state that's far more terrible than anything I can experience while alive. That fear has poisoned my remaining years, has made it difficult to enjoy things, difficult to connect with people, difficult to find meaning or purpose or peace. Because what's the point of any of it if the ending is what I suspect it might be? What's the point of living well if you're just heading toward an experience so terrible that everything before it becomes retroactively meaningless? I know that's irrational thinking. Know I'm letting fear distort my perspective. Know that even if death is as bad as I fear, that doesn't make life meaningless. The experiences are still real, the connections still valuable, the joy and beauty and love still worth having even if they're temporary and leading towards something dark. But knowledge doesn't always translate into feeling, and I feel hopeless more often than not. Feel like I'm just marking time until the inevitable happens. Feel like I'm already dead in all the ways that matter, just waiting for my body to catch up with the reality that my life effectively ended in November 1998 when Michael Reeves grabbed my wrist and whispered his warning. Is this what he experienced? This sense of being trapped, unable to move forward, aware but helpless? This liminal state that's neither fully life nor death but something suspended between? If so, I understand why he was so desperate. Why he reached back across the threshold to deliver his warning. Because if this is what it's like, this awareness without agency, this consciousness without capacity to change anything, then it's its own kind of hell. One you do anything to escape from or at least warn others about. I'm warning you now, not just about what might await at the threshold of death, but about what happens when you believe someone who delivers that warning. About how that knowledge changes you, poisons you, makes the rest of your life harder to bear because you're living in fear of what comes after. Maybe you should dismiss this testimony. Maybe you should file it under delusion or entertainment or the ramblings of an old man whose mind has been broken by too much exposure to death. Maybe protecting yourself from this knowledge is wiser than accepting it as potentially true. Because once you accept it, once you genuinely believe that death might involve what Michael described, you can't go back to comfortable ignorance. You can't unknow it. You can't stop being afraid. And fear is corrosive. It eats away at joy, at peace, at the capacity to live fully in the present rather than dreading the future. It turns every good moment into something temporary and every bad moment into a preview of what's to come. It makes life feel like a waiting room before an appointment you're terrified to keep. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Wouldn't want anyone else to spend their remaining years the way I've spent mine, obsessed with death, afraid of the ending, unable to find peace or acceptance or any of the things that might make mortality bearable. So maybe keep your distance from this knowledge. Maybe protect yourself by choosing not to believe. Maybe maintain the comfortable fiction that death is simple cessation or peaceful transition or whatever story lets you live without fear. Those fictions have value. They let people function, let them enjoy their lives, let them face mortality without crippling terror. Breaking those fictions, as Michael did for me, might do more harm than good even if the truth underneath is real. But I've told you anyway. I've shared everything despite knowing it might hurt more than help. Because I couldn't carry it alone anymore. Couldn't keep silent about what I experienced and what I believe it means. Couldn't die without at least trying to warn others about possibilities they might not have considered. Whether that was the right choice, whether this testimony helps or harms, whether I've done something valuable or something cruel, I don't know. Won't know. Can only hope that somewhere, somehow, sharing this serves some purpose beyond my own need to finally speak after 17 years of silence. The sun is setting outside my window. Another day ending. Another night approaching. Another cycle of waking and sleeping and aging and declining. Another step closer to that threshold I've been dreading since November 1998. How much longer? Months? Years? There's no way to predict. Death comes on its own schedule, following its own logic. All I can do is wait and hope and try to make peace with what's coming. But peace feels impossible when you believe what I believe, when you've experienced what I've experienced, when you're convinced that the ending might be far worse than anyone typically imagines. So I'll continue as I have been, documenting my decline, watching for signs, hoping for mercy, dreading the inevitable, living in fear of the one thing I can't avoid, can't prevent, can't prepare for adequately no matter how many years I spend thinking about it. This is what Michael's warning has cost me. This is what that impossible encounter left me with. 17 years of fear and counting. However many years remain until I finally discover whether he was telling the truth. I'll find out eventually. We all will. And when I do, when I'm standing at that threshold experiencing whatever he tried to warn me about, I'll have one final moment of knowledge. One final moment to understand whether everything I feared was justified or whether I wasted my remaining years terrified of nothing. One final moment to see whether the darkness really does look back, whether something really is waiting to mark and claim and trap consciousness in that liminal space Michael described. One final moment before I either cross cleanly into whatever comes next or find myself trapped as he was, aware but helpless, caught at the threshold with something holding me back from the mercy of ending. That moment is coming, approaching with every beat of my aging heart, getting closer with every passing day. And I'm afraid. After 42 years of working with death professionally, after 17 years of thinking about it obsessively, after a lifetime of trying to understand what it is and how it works and what it means, I'm still afraid. Maybe everyone is, regardless of what they believe or what they know or how long they've thought about it. Maybe fear of death is simply part of being conscious, part of being aware of our own mortality, part of being creatures who can contemplate our own ending. Or maybe my fear is special. Maybe it's justified in ways most people's isn't. Maybe Michael really did give me advance warning about something terrible, and my fear is the appropriate response to genuine knowledge about what awaits. I don't know which, and I'm tired of not knowing, tired of uncertainty, tired of fear, tired of waiting. But I'll keep waiting anyway, because that's what living means at this point. Waiting for death, dreading it, hoping it will be merciful despite believing it probably won't be. That's my existence now. That's what Michael's warning reduced me to. And that's what I'm sharing with you through this testimony, not just information about what might await at death's threshold, but a warning about what happens to you if you take that information seriously. You become like me, trapped, afraid, living in dread of the ending rather than embracing the life that remains. Is that better than ignorance? Is knowing worth the cost? I can't answer that. Can only tell you what it's cost me and let you decide whether the knowledge is worth accepting. For me, it's too late. The knowledge is already there. The fear already established. The damage already done. But for you, maybe there's still a choice. Maybe you can hear this testimony and choose not to believe it. Choose to maintain your comfortable assumptions about death. Choose to protect yourself from the fear that's consumed my last 17 years. If you can do that, if you can hear what I've said and still live without fear, then don't believe me. Don't accept this as true. Protect yourself by choosing skepticism over acceptance. But if you're like me, if once you hear something you can't unhear it, can't dismiss it, can't stop yourself from believing it might be true, then you're already trapped. Already afraid in ways you weren't before. Already counting down toward a threshold that seems far more dangerous than it did before you heard Michael Reeves' warning filtered through my 17 years of fear and interpretation. And for that, I'm sorry. Sorry if this testimony has hurt you. Sorry if it's introduced fear where before there was peace. Sorry if I've poisoned your relationship with your own mortality the way Michael poisoned mine. But I've spoken. The testimony is given. The warning delivered. What you do with it, whether you believe or dismiss, whether you fear or maintain peace, whether you prepare or ignore, is up to you. I've done all I can. Shared all I know. Warned as clearly as I'm able about possibilities I believe are real even though I can't prove them. The rest is silence. And waiting. And that slow, inevitable approach toward the threshold where all questions will finally be answered. May your crossing be clean. May you never encounter what Michael encountered. May death be simple for you in ways I fear it won't be simple for me. And may you forget this testimony as quickly as you heard it, protecting yourself from knowledge that helps nothing and harms everything except the truth. Because the truth, if it is truth, may not be worth knowing, may cost more than it gives, may break something in you that can't be repaired. It broke something in me, something fundamental, something I'll carry broken until I die and discover whether being broken was the appropriate response to genuine knowledge or whether I shattered myself for nothing. Soon enough, I'll know. The waiting can't last forever. Death is patient, but it always arrives. And when it does, when I'm finally standing at that threshold I've dreaded for 17 years, I'll have one final thought before I discover what's true. I'll think about this testimony, about whether telling you helped anyone or just spread the fear that's consumed me. I'll think about Michael Reeves and whether he regrets reaching back to warn me, whether my 17 years of suffering justified delivering that warning. I'll think about all of you who heard this, and I'll hope that somehow, somewhere, this testimony served a purpose beyond my own need to finally speak. And then I'll cross. or try to, or find myself trapped as Michael was, consciousness persisting past the body's death, held at the threshold by something I can't see or fight or escape. Whatever happens, at least I'll finally know. Finally have certainty instead of fear. Finally understand whether everything I believed was justified or whether I spent 17 years afraid of nothing. That knowledge is coming. For me, and eventually for all of you. The only certainty in an uncertain existence. We're all heading toward that threshold. All approaching the moment when we'll discover what's true about death, about consciousness, about what waits on the other side. I'll see you there. Or I won't. Depending on whether consciousness persists, whether there's any seeing possible past death, whether Michael was telling the truth about that liminal space where some people get trapped. Until then, until that final moment of discovery, all I can say is what I've said throughout this testimony. Be careful what you look for in the darkness. Sometimes the darkness looks back. And if it sees you, everything changes. That's the warning. That's the truth as I understand it. That's everything I learned from one impossible night and 17 years of living in its shadow. Dr. Marcus Webb, signing off for the final time. Waiting, afraid, hoping for mercy I don't expect to receive. May you fare better than I fear I will when we all eventually face the darkness and discover whether it's really looking back. Goodbye, and good luck. You're going to need it if even half of what I've told you turns out to be true.